The most evil queens you've never heard of. One queen burned her enemies alive and was still remembered as graceful, not feared, not hated, respected, because power doesn't always look violent. Sometimes it looks elegant. Behind the crowns and ceremonies, rulers like Wu Zetian built control through fear, manipulation, and silence, while maintaining an image the world accepted without question. And here's what makes it unsettling. Some of the most ruthless queens in history were never remembered as villains. Their actions softened, their stories reshaped, their reputations protected, because power doesn't just rule, it edits. So the real question isn't who was dangerous, it's how many of them were never exposed at all. Take Wu Zetian, the only woman to rule China in her own name. Official court histories, largely written by men who served later regimes, describe a ruler who used ruthless purges, secret police, and strategic accusations to eliminate rivals. Members of her own family were not exempt. At the same time, those same records concede that she expanded the civil service examinations and stabilized parts of the empire. So which version is true? Both, and neither in full, because what survives is filtered through those who wrote it. Then there's Ranavalona I. Her reign is often remembered through accounts from missionaries and foreign observers. Sources that describe forced labor, harsh trials, and severe punishments that reduced the population dramatically. But those same sources were outsiders, operating within their own agendas. Ranavalona's rule was also a deliberate resistance to foreign influence, an attempt to preserve sovereignty in the face of colonial pressure, which creates a complicated picture. A ruler who was both defender and destroyer, depending on where you stand. Look at Isabella of France, often labeled the she-wolf. She helped orchestrate the downfall of her husband, Edward II, and seized control of the English throne alongside her ally. Chroniclers painted her as manipulative and dangerous. Yet those same chronicles were shaped by political loyalties after her fall from power. Her actions were ruthless, yes, but they also reflect a woman navigating a system where power was rarely given. It had to be taken. And then there are queens whose reputations were shaped almost entirely by rumor. Fredegund, for example, is often described as orchestrating assassinations, betrayals, and brutal acts to secure her position. But much of what we know comes from hostile sources, writers aligned with her rivals. Was she truly as calculating and violent as portrayed? Or was she written that way because she succeeded in a world that didn't expect her to? This is the pattern that begins to emerge. The term evil isn't always a clear category. It's often a label applied after the fact, especially to women in power. Actions that might be framed as strategic or necessary for kings were often described as cruel or unnatural when carried out by queens. That doesn't mean these rulers were innocent. It means their stories are complicated because behind every accusation, every dramatic account, every label, there's context, political conflict, cultural bias, power struggles that shaped how these women were remembered. And sometimes, what's most revealing isn't just what's written, it's what's emphasized, which events were highlighted, which details were repeated, which perspectives were preserved, because when history is filtered, it doesn't just tell you what happened, it tells you what someone wanted remembered. And that's where things become unsettling. Because some of these queens may have ruled with genuine brutality, using fear, force, and elimination to maintain control. But others may have been turned into villains through narratives designed to diminish or discredit them. And once that label sticks, it defines them for centuries. So when you hear about evil queens, the real question isn't just what they did. It's who decided how their story would be told. And why? Because the deeper you look, harder it becomes to separate reputation from reality. And in that gap between what happened and what was written is where the truth starts to blur. And this is where the story takes a darker and more revealing turn. Because some queens didn't just inherit power, they held on to it in ways that left marks history couldn't fully erase. Take Olga of Kiev. Today she is remembered as a saint in parts of Eastern Europe. But before that transformation, her rise to power was marked by calculated vengeance. After her husband was killed, accounts describe a series of retaliations so precise and so relentless that they became legend. Entire delegations eliminated, cities burned through strategy rather than brute force. It wasn't chaos, it was controlled retribution, and yet later narratives reframed her legacy, focusing on her conversion and leadership rather than the brutality that secured her position. Which raises a powerful question: how easily can history soften what once seemed unforgivable? Then there's Cixi, a woman who ruled from behind the throne during the final years of the Qing dynasty. Some accounts describe her as manipulative, indulgent, even responsible for weakening the empire. Others portray her as a strategic survivor, navigating internal rebellion and external pressure. Decisions made under her influence, whether conservative or reformist, were often filtered through political agendas after her death. So again, the image splits: ruthless ruler or misunderstood strategist. Because when empires fall, someone has to be blamed, and those who held power, especially in unconventional ways, often become the easiest targets. Now consider Queen Mary I. Her reign is often reduced to a single label: Bloody Mary. It's a name tied to the persecution and execution of religious opponents during her rule. And those events were real. But what's often overlooked is how her story was shaped after her death, during the reign of her successor, who had every reason to emphasize those actions and define Mary's legacy through them. Because history isn't just about actions, it's about who tells the story afterward. And sometimes that story is sharpened, simplified, turned into something more absolute than reality. Then there are queens whose reputations exist almost entirely in shadow, figures mentioned briefly, framed negatively, and then left behind. Their actions recorded just enough to define them, but not enough to understand them, which might be the most unsettling part of all, because absence of detail doesn't mean absence of complexity. It often means something was lost or removed. And when that happens, what remains can feel one-dimensional: a villain without context, a reputation without balance. But history rarely works that way. Real power is messy, decisions are layered, and the line between survival and cruelty is often thinner than it appears, especially for women in positions where failure wasn't just personal, it was fatal. Which brings us back to the idea of evil. What does it actually mean in a historical context? Is it defined by actions alone, or by how those actions were remembered, interpreted, and repeated over time? Because when you look closely, you start to see that many of these queens operated within systems that demanded strength, control, and sometimes harsh decisions. The difference is how those decisions were framed. A king consolidating power might be called decisive. A queen doing the same might be called ruthless. And once that framing takes hold, it becomes history. But here's the deeper truth. Some of these queens were undeniably brutal. Their actions caused real suffering, real loss, real consequences. That can't be ignored. At the same time, others may have been shaped into something more extreme than they actually were. because their stories were told through lenses that weren't neutral. And when you put all of this together, one thing becomes clear. The most dangerous thing about power isn't just what it does in the moment. It's how it's remembered afterward, because memory, like power, can be controlled, edited, rewritten. And once it is, it defines everything that comes next. If this made you question what you thought you knew, then you're seeing history the way it really is. Layered, complex, and often incomplete. If you want more hidden stories, controversial figures, and the truths that were shaped or buried over time, make sure you subscribe and stay with us. Because the deeper you go into history, more you realize. It's not just about who ruled, it's about who controlled the story after they were gone.